Vancouver has a lot of advantages when it comes to urban cycling. It has a very mild climate by Canadian standards, with winter weather being pretty comparable to the Netherlands. And it has a West Coast culture that embraces the outdoors and physical activity. It also has a lot of dense, mixed-use, transit-oriented development in the central city and near SkyTrain stations where you don't automatically need a car. Parts of it are hilly, but whether you encounter big climbs depends a lot on your route, and it's not until you go to the suburbs, mainly on the North Shore, that you actually encounter mountains and the climbs really become relentless. In this video, we're going to cover the good and bad of cycling in Vancouver based on our recent trip, and we're going to give our thoughts on how Vancouver stacks up as a Canadian cycling city.
One feature that stands out is the Vancouver Seawall. We don't mean the 8-kilometer one-way recreational path around Stanley Park, although that's nice too. The more interesting part, for the purposes of this channel, is the 15-kilometer route around the downtown peninsula and False Creek that connects different neighborhoods and commercial areas that border the water. For the most part, the path is more spacious and has better separation between pedestrians and cyclists than other urban water parkways, like the Martin Goodman Trail in Toronto, the Lachine Canal in Montreal, or the Rideau Canal in Ottawa. But what's even more interesting is that the seawall in some places works kind of like a pedestrian street that residential buildings open onto. Because Vancouver's high-rise towers usually sit on a base of townhouses on the first 2 or 3 floors, many people have a personal front door opening directly onto a car-free street, which is pretty unique. These units are very expensive and out of reach for normal people. But Vancouver's affordability crisis is a bigger problem that doesn't take away from the good design here.
Another highlight of the seawall is the stretch along Sunset Bay Beach and English Bay Beach, where, to give people more space during COVID, the city closed the beachside paths to cyclists, and in return gave them a spacious concrete-separated portion of Beach Avenue, the road just up the hill from the water. There are a few sections where the street configuration is a little weird, but overall it's a wonderful experience. This is the kind of on-street cycling experience that's really suitable for all ages and abilities. This new configuration is technically temporary, but it would be surprising if it didn't stick around because it handles an enormous volume of traffic. According to the city, it regularly hits 10,000 cyclists per day, which makes it the busiest bike route in Vancouver, and even beats Montreal's well-used top bike routes like the Rev on Saint-Denis.
Beyond the seawall, Vancouver has many protected bike lanes, especially downtown, including 2-way cycle tracks on Richards and Dunsmuir, and 1-way cycle tracks on Pacific, Nelson, and over the Burrard Bridge. These are pretty good, but with a few inconsistencies and gaps, like a dead zone in the middle of Granville Street without any bike infrastructure at all, and a section on Burrard Street heading towards downtown, where there's only a bike lane on the other side of the road. For a moment on this stretch, we almost felt like we were deep in car-centric suburbia instead of a pretty urban part of Vancouver. We got off the road and walked this part. Worse than that, and probably the worst road experience we had in Vancouver, was the Granville Bridge, which is essentially an 8-lane highway that makes pedestrians, cyclists, and skateboarders crowd onto a narrow sidewalk between fast-moving traffic and a deadly fall. I don't remember a time when I felt this wronged by infrastructure.
And we live in Ottawa.
Fortunately, we didn't try to bike across this, but walking it was extremely unpleasant, and it made us understand why someone would choose a water taxi to get to Granville Island instead. It's not like downtown Vancouver is a car-free pedestrian paradise or anything, but the Granville Bridge stood out and seemed like a relic from another era, like smoking in restaurants or on airplanes.
One unique part of Vancouver is that most of its bike network, especially outside of downtown, isn't based on bike lanes, whether protected or unprotected. Instead, it's based on greenways and local street bikeways. This includes the Arbutus Greenway, an old railway line turned into a multi-use pathway a few years ago, but in most cases these are residential streets shared between cars and bikes with only stretches of dedicated lanes. This sounds bad, but the ones we saw actually worked out well. For example, Chilco Street and Comox Avenue in the West End, York Avenue and Cypress Street in Kitsilano, and 10th Avenue in Mount Pleasant. The key to these streets providing a comfortable cycling experience is modal filtering, or in other words using barriers, parks, and permeable cul-de-sacs that block cars but allow cyclists to pass through. These streets also make use of one-way designations, sometimes alternating, that apply to cars but not to bikes. Additionally, the speed limits are low, typically 30 kilometers an hour, and the streets aren't so wide that they encourage speeding. And, as an added touch, most intersections have small roundabouts. Together, these designs keep traffic reasonably low and slow. Drivers don't have a reason to use these streets unless they have a destination there.
There are some downsides, though. Narrow streets slowing down traffic is nice, but in some places there's hardly enough room to pass by an oncoming car. It can be confusing as a visitor because you worry whether you turned onto the right street. In general, protected bike lanes are just more visually prominent. They're easy to notice, follow, and judge the quality of. With a shared street, the experience depends a lot on traffic calming measures elsewhere on the street that you can't immediately see. We didn't make it that far out of the central city because we mostly relied on bike share, which has a limited service area, but from Google Street View it seems like other areas have much less traffic calming and modal filtering on their local street bikeways. There are whole areas of Vancouver that seem like bike infrastructure deserts as a result, although again we don't have personal experience going out this far except on transit.
One other negative of cycling in Vancouver is the mandatory helmet law active across the province, although it doesn't seem to be enforced because at least half of the city bikes have lost their attached helmets. We usually choose to wear helmets ourselves, given the inconsistent and sometimes hostile infrastructure we encounter, and for style, but we're against this mandatory helmet law. Helmets can protect your head just like cycling gloves can protect your hands, but whether they're important or necessary depends on what kind of cycling you're doing and where you're doing it. Mandatory helmet laws don't allow for this difference in context, or for people to make their own risk calculations, and they take our eyes off the fact that the ultimate goal is to make infrastructure where cycling is more like a brisk walk than a dangerous, risk-taking sport where you fear for your life and health every day.
Overall, though, we found biking in Vancouver to be a pretty good experience. Aside from challenges related to the city bikes, like them being surprisingly heavy and most of them not actually having helmets attached, despite the law. When it comes to infrastructure, Vancouver doesn't blow all other Canadian cities out of the water, but it does a lot of things right that other places can learn from, especially making the seawall in places function like a quasi-pedestrianized street and really embracing filtered permeability with street designs that reduce car traffic but allow and encourage bike traffic. We'd rank Vancouver higher than Toronto or Ottawa, and on par with Montreal based on our experiences, when we account for the fact that we stayed within the central city and didn't experience the suburbs by bike like we did in other cities. Our judgment lines up with the Copenhagenize Index of Bike-Friendly Cities, which has Montreal and Vancouver tied as the only two Canadian cities on the list.
One other fascinating part of cycling in Vancouver is looking into bike infrastructure projects and seeing what opposition looks like there. We're used to skeptics in Toronto and Montreal saying that bikes aren't practical in those cities because it snows in the winter. Well, skeptics in Vancouver say that bike infrastructure isn't practical because it rains in the winter. We don't mean to imply that weather is never a real challenge, but it puts into perspective that every city has its complaints with the local weather. One unexpected part of the pedestrian experience in Vancouver for us was the number of loud and aggressively driven luxury cars that we saw and heard. This isn't something we've noticed so much in other Canadian cities, but it might also be related to the milder weather.
How do you think Vancouver lines up in terms of bike infrastructure? Leave us a comment with your thoughts below. A big thanks goes out to our patrons, some of whom we had the opportunity to meet in Vancouver. As always, don't forget to bike and subscribe.